Hello everyone, I welcome you all in this course Introduction to Sequence Stratigraphy. In this class, we will discuss about some basic ideas in sequence stratigraphy in terms of data input and workflow. So, in sequence stratigraphy or when we try to do sequence stratigraphy, then we try to imply or we try to compile input from several branches. We try to get input from definitely sedimentology, which is the base of sequence stratigraphy. Definitely stratigraphy is also the base of sequence stratigraphy. But apart from these two primary subject areas, which are directly related to sequence stratigraphy, we can also get input or we can also relate with other subject areas like geophysics, like geochemistry, like paleontology. So, all these subject areas have their own input and they can help us in identification of or interpretation of different elements within sequence stratigraphy. So, in this particular class, we were going to discuss about these different types of data input that we can commonly use, that we can commonly get, how they can help in sequence stratigraphy, and using those data input, what are the common workflow that we follow when we do some sequence stratigraphic work from a sedimentary succession. So, sequence stratigraphy, it builds on many existing data sources, and to understand sequence stratigraphy, to interpret a sequence stratigraphic model, we require a very good knowledge of sedimentology, facies analysis. As already we have seen in our previous classes that how facies analysis, facies associations, they are very integrally associated with the concept of sequence and sequence stratigraphy. But apart from this branch of sequence stratigraphy also integrates other field of sedimentary geology, other field of geology itself, other field of geophysics, geomorphology, and also we rely a lot on absolute and relative edge dating techniques, because many times the surfaces that we are demarcating are associated or may have some edge correlations, and very often we rely largely on basin analysis, because that gives us an overview about the overall tectono-sedimentary condition of the sedimentary basins. And for sequence stratigraphic interpretation, we should have a very clear idea about the tectono-sedimentary evolution of the basin through time. So, in sequence stratigraphy, it is very open in terms of welcoming the data input. So, when we are working in the sequence stratigraphic domain, we are very much open in terms of receiving data, getting input from all the broad fields, and the nature of data, the source of data can be anything that can start from seismics in very large scale to a very small scale like a core sample, or maybe a hand specimen sample collected from the field, maybe some primary sedimentary structures preserved in the field. So, all such data input are always integrated within sequence stratigraphic model, and using all those inputs we try to develop a convincing sequence stratigraphic interpretation or sequence stratigraphic model for the given rock succession. As we know that in case of any modeling effort, the reliability of that particular model depends on the quality and variety of the input data. If you have more input data and the quality of data is good, you can have a much better model. The same is also applicable in sequence stratigraphy. So, the more data we have from different sources, from different aspects, not only from sedimentology, but from other aspects, and the quality of the data, if it is of high quality data, definitely the resultant sequence stratigraphic model will be more convincing. So, integration of as many data sets as possible is always recommended in sequence stratigraphy. So, in fact, in different academic institutes as well as in industries, there are commonly people from different branches, different expertise. They assemble together, make a team and work together to do some sequence stratigraphic work, where these different expertise of people, they provide input of their own domain and they are all compiled together, and finally that results in a very good sequence stratigraphic model. So, when we talk about the data sources, there can be several types of data set. So, it can start from seismic profiles, which is one of the fundamental data source. It can be well logs. So, these are the geophysics part. Different types of well logs can be used, for example, gamma ray log, for example, resistivity log, it can be sonic log, it can be SP log, it can be density log. So, depending on what kind of data source is available, what kind of rocks are available. So, we can get input from different types of well logs. Similarly, we can get data from core samples. Very often during this well logging, core samples are also recovered and that can be used for a reliable data source in sequence stratigraphy. Apart from this, we can also have some outcrops. This has no alternative, outcrops. So, rock successions present in the outcrops. So, outcrops, there can be some large outcrops or there can be some small outcrops. So, they have their own advantages, disadvantages in terms of data input. And apart from this outcrop part, we can also get input from say geochemistry. We can also get input from paleontology. We can also get input from geochronology, where age determination is the primary focus, geochronology. So, these are some of the important types of data set, important data input, which are used in sequence stratigraphy very frequently, and all these data sources, all these types of data set, they have their own merits and demerits. So, it is always recommended that when we are trying to do sequence stratigraphic modeling, sequence stratigraphic work, we try to encompass as many data as possible from all these different sources. So, this includes geophysics, this includes geology itself, including sedimentology, it includes geochronology, it includes paleontology, geochemistry, and it can go on. So, in this class, we will try to look into these individual data sources in terms of what kind of input we can get from these sources and what are the merits and demerits of these individual data sources. So, first we start with the seismic data. In case of seismic data, we get a continuous subsurface imaging. We can get idea about the large scale tectonic setting of the basin. We get idea about the structural styles, because in seismic data, we are getting a seismic profile across the entire basin, where the regional stratigraphic architecture and imaging of the all possible depositional elements can be very easily observed. So, seismic data commonly provide a fundamental means for preliminary evolution of a basin fill, particularly when we do not have the surface exposures available, outcrops not available. All the exposures, all the rock types are present in the subsurface condition, and standing on the surface we cannot see anything over there. So, in such cases, seismic data provides us the primary and a broad overview of the entire basin fill succession at a glance. And commonly we do this, we commonly take this seismic data, seismic profile prior to drilling, so that at least we get a primary idea that where to start from. And there we get a broad overview about the overall structure, overall stratigraphic architecture, and if there is some resources available somewhere in terms of say hydrocarbon, maybe some groundwater. So, seismic data or seismic profile is the base, is the start point from where we should start sequence stratigraphic work, because understanding of the basin scale tectonics, basin scale sediment profile is very important for interpretation of sequence stratigraphy. The makeup of the seismic image, commonly we call that as the seismic profile. it reflects the interaction between the substrate geology and the seismic waves which are traveling through the rocks, and that commonly represents the modulations created by physical properties of the rocks, which gets finally represented in seismic profiles. So, through seismic profiles, basically what we are getting is how different rock units are occurring in the subsurface. So, seismic data are regarded as very much useful for assessing larger scale structural and stratigraphic styles. But in many cases, we cannot apply that directly, as we have to interpret something in relatively smaller scale, because the resolution is not suitable over there. So, for smaller scale interpretation, for further detailed interpretation, we have to rely on some other data input. What can be the data input? Commonly we rely on well log data. Again, we are relying on the geophysics aspect. So, in case of well log data, as I told you earlier, there can be different types of well log, like gamma ray log, like density log, SP log, resistivity log. So, depending on what type of logs we are using, what kind of tool we are using, we can get a clear idea about the variation in the lithology and how those different lithologies are occurring in vertical stacking patterns. From that, we can also get idea about the depositional systems, depositional elements, and when we try to correlate this well log data, we get idea about the lateral facies trends. So, when we combine this data with the seismic data is giving us large scale overview, and then within these individual portions of the seismic profile, we can put the well log data, and that can provide us much detailed interpretation of the seismic profiles. So, well logs, they commonly represent geophysical recordings of various rock properties as recorded from the boreholes and can be used for interpretation of different geological aspects. So, the data provided by well logs may be considered more complete relative to the discontinuous information that may be extracted from the study of outcrops. So, well logs can be considered as intermediate between outcrop condition and the seismic profiles. In seismic profiles, we get large scale overview, but there the scope of going into the details is limited. In case of outcrops, we can get a detailed idea, because there we can see the rocks, there we can touch the rock, we can observe all the properties of the rocks, but the problem is continuity of the outcrops. So, well logs are like intermediate between these two end members, where we get some sort of continuity through correlations, we get little bit more detailed idea about the rock types, how they are stacked and how they are laterally varying. So, the subsurface investigation of facies relationships and the stratigraphic correlations can usually be accomplished at scales much larger than the ones possible from the study of outcrops. So, in many industries as well as in the academics, well log data, well log interpretations of the facies architecture is very well established and very well accepted. The well log data have certain limitations, because there we cannot get a direct view of the rock body itself. From the signals, we are interpreting about the rock types. We do not get idea about the primary sedimentary structures. We do not get much idea about the texture. We can get idea about them through some interpretations, but not a detailed or direct view or observations, which can be compensated or which can be complemented by using some core sample data. So, core data, they are actually the core material which are generally recovered when some borehole is created, some well logging is going on. But normally this is a bit expensive process. So, industries or particularly those people who work in the geophysics domain, well logging domain, they try to avoid this core material or recovery of core until and unless it is essential. So, if I talk about, say for example, some reservoir rock body, then that particular industry will be interested in keeping the core of that particular reservoir part only, not the other portions which are not useful for them. In some cases, unless there is some borehole is drilled for research work or maybe for some exploration. In those cases, we can get a continuous coring, which is very expensive in nature, and normally we do not get that access, and that is the limitation of core data. If we are getting core data, we can straightaway get an idea about the subsurface lithology. We can get a direct idea or record of the texture and sedimentary structures present within that rock in the subsurface. We can get idea about the nature of stratigraphic contact. We can get idea about the physical rock properties. Even in some cases, if we can collect oriented cores, we can interpret the paleo current directions. So, when we calibrate the core data with well logs and seismic data, they can give us wonderful result. But the problem is with the preservation or recovery of the core samples, because in many cases recovery is very difficult. In many cases it is avoided because of cost factor. So, core data basically, the problem is with their continuity. In terms of vertical logs, we may not get a continuous core data across the entire sedimentary succession. So, the next one is the outcrop data. There is no alternative to outcrops. Nothing can replace the study of the actual rocks which are present, which you can see, and we can note down all the properties. So, outcrop data can give us straightway the 3D distribution pattern of facies architecture. We can straightway get idea about the process sedimentology. We can interpret about the lithofacies, the depositional elements. We can interpret about the depositional systems and all other applications which we have discussed so far in terms of well log and core data. So, nothing can replace the study of the actual rocks. Hence, the wealth of details which commonly are preserved in outcrops can be obtained through a detailed study of the outcrop systems. So, that cannot be matched with well log analysis, that cannot be matched with core sample analysis. So, if you have outcrops and they are continuous enough, they are large enough, that is the best way to do the sequence stratigraphic work. Now, the problem with outcrop data is about their continuity. So, outcrops, if it is a large scale outcrop, it is very helpful, but if you have small scale outcrops, then there will be again the problem of lateral continuity of data, and in those cases we face a lot of problem. Next comes the geochemical data. So, geochemistry is another aspect which gives us lot of information in terms of depositional environment, in terms of depositional processes. We get idea about the diagenesis, and not only that, also we get idea about the paleoclimatic conditions, paleoecological conditions, paleoweathering conditions. And when within the geochemistry part, when we move into the isotope part, there we can get the determination of age, which comes under the geochronology, where we can straightway interpret or determine the absolute age of the rocks which are associated with certain surfaces which are important in terms of sequence stratigraphy. Same kind of interpretation can be obtained from paleontological data, because fossils, they are often associated with certain age. They come with certain absolute or relative ages which can be very effectively used in determination of the age of the termination surfaces within sequence stratigraphic packages. So, all these data types, starting from seismic to well log, core, outcrop, and then geochemical and paleontological data, all of them have certain limitations and have certain advantages. So, in sequence stratigraphy, we try to get input from all these sources, because then only all these demerits can be avoided and we can get the best result in terms of the most appropriate sequence stratigraphic model. So, if I try to understand how these different data sets are useful in a sequence stratigraphic workflow, say for example, we can take two major aspects. One is the geology aspect. So, there we are getting some outcrop data, and outcrop data again can be large or small, large scale outcrop or small scale outcrops. We can get some sample data from core samples. So, in this particular case, in these three cases, we are getting a direct input from the rock record. We are getting direct idea about the lithology, primary structure, texture, nature of contacts, paleocurrent, and from there we can straightway interpret about the depositional environments. Or we can have the geophysical aspect where we can get some well logs, or we can have the seismic profiles. So, as I have told you so far, when we are looking for large scale interpretations, say for example, in case of tectonics, if I want to know what is the tectonic condition of the basin. So, large scale outcrops can help us a little bit. Maybe we can increase the number of ticks over here to indicate how much it is important. So, definitely seismics are the most suitable for understanding the tectonics of the basin. From lateral correlation of the well logs, we can get little bit idea about that, but we cannot get anything from core samples. We cannot get anything from small scale outcrops. We can get little bit from these large scale outcrops. Say for example, if we want to do some facies analysis, which is one of the fundamental part for sequence stratigraphy. So, definitely large scale outcrops are the best, small scale outcrops are also very good, core samples are also quite good in that. Well logs, fine, we can do facies analysis up to certain extent using well logs, but definitely seismic is not useful over here. If I want to understand about the depositional environment, if I want to interpret the depositional environment, so definitely large scale outcrops are very good in that, small scale outcrops up to certain extent with certain limitations, because there the problem will be in terms of the continuity of data. Core samples are not that much helpful. Well logs again to some extent, when the correlation is good, we can get idea about the depositional environment up to certain extent, and seismics again not that good. What we can get over here, distribution of different depositional system, that can be done from seismic profiles, but in terms of the actual interpretation of the depositional environment, that will be quite difficult in terms of seismic profiles. Similarly, if I want to say for example, the stratal stacking pattern, stratal stacking and terminations, say we want to identify some onlapping successions, onlapping packages, onlapping truncation surfaces, definitely we can do that from the large scale outcrops. We cannot do that in small scale, we cannot do that with core samples. We can do that up to certain extent for the well logs, and definitely we can do that very well, very good in seismic profiles, whether it is a 2D seismic profile or 3D seismic profile. So, from this particular table or this particular distribution, you can understand that how this different data input, they have their merit and demerits. So, it is always suggested that try to get input from all these areas, because each of them will give you a separate type of input which will be useful in final sequence stratigraphic interpretation. So, if I try to look into the workflow when you are getting all this data, then how we will proceed in sequence stratigraphy. So, it normally starts with integration of data derived from the study of outcrops, cores, well logs, seismic volumes. So, all these data sources are accumulated first and then they are compiled together. When that compilation is done, we go for understanding what type of sedimentary basin is it, what type of tectono-sedimentary condition is prevailing over there, which can be straightway done from the seismic profiles and also can be further substantiated using large scale outcrops. When the basin type is known to us, we can understand what will be the distribution of different sedimentary environments, and from that idea we can interpret about the type of facies, the depositional systems which are possible in different parts of that particular basin. So, there comes the interpretation of paleodepositional environments, which is based on outcrop data, core data and definitely some amount of well log data, where we go through facies analysis and we try to interpret about different paleodepositional environments occurring within the entire basin. Then comes the depositional trend, that means the stratal stacking pattern with respect to the shoreline shift. How different stratal stacking pattern is occurring with respect to the depositional trend and how they are getting terminated. So, there again comes the role of large scale outcrops, there again comes the role of seismic profiles and definitely the well logs. So, we talk about the stratal terminations, which can be very easily observed in seismic profiles and also can be observed in large scale outcrops. When we identify the stratal terminations, that lead us to understand about what are the different stratigraphic surfaces. When I am talking about stratigraphic surfaces, that means the sequence stratigraphic surfaces. Surfaces which are important in sequence stratigraphy, that can be a sequence boundary, that can be a system strat boundary. So, from there we try to interpret about the sequence stratigraphic elements in terms of different system strats and sequences. So, in sequence stratigraphy, our work follows this kind of workflow pattern. So, integration of data finally leads us to this final point where we come up with a sequence model where the individual sequences are covered by some stratigraphic surfaces, and within individual sequences we can get multiple system strats indicating the shift in the depositional trend through time. So, in later classes we will discuss about these individual units in more detail, individual processes in more detail. Now gradually we will move on to the next phase of our learning, where we will move on to the different elements of sequence stratigraphy. So, each data set that we have discussed in this particular class will contribute with some useful information, which can be very much useful in terms of the recognition of depositional trends in the rock record. But definitely, as we have seen in this particular discussion in this class, that large scale outcrops and the seismic profiles, they have some extra advantages. They are more relevant for work in sequence stratigraphy because they give us kind of large scale tectono-sedimentary information, tectono-sedimentary picture, which is very much important for understanding or interpretation of the sequence stratigraphy of a particular succession. So, these are some of the references, some of the extra material that you can follow, you can go through for further reading. So, thank you everybody.